The gunshot wound in General Marcus Whitfield's abdomen was bleeding faster than the ER staff could track. He had been rushed in 20 minutes earlier, still barking orders through gritted teeth, still trying to command a room that no longer belonged to him. Around his bed stood a wall of nurses and residents, their faces pale with the particular fear reserved for treating a man who outranked everyone breathing. Monitors screamed intermittent warnings, for bags swayed overhead, and Whitfield, 3 stars pinned to a uniform now soaked dark at the waist, jabbed a bloody finger toward Dr. Alan Reyes, the trauma attending trying to keep him alive. "I don't want residents," Whitfield growled, his voice cracking with pain and fury in equal measure. "I don't want your second-string team fumbling around in my gut. Get me your best surgeon. Now." Dr. Reyes kept both palms raised, the universal gesture of a man trying to calm a wounded animal. "General, I promise you, everyone in this room is qualified. I said your best." Whitfield's hand slammed against the bed rail. "I have led men into fire. I have signed off on operations that decided the fate of nations. I did not survive Kandahar to bleed out under a doctor still wet behind the ears. Get me your top surgeon or get out of my way and let me die with some dignity." The room went silent except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, ticking faster than it should. Reyes exchanged a glance with the charge nurse, who gave the smallest nod. There was, in fact, one surgeon on call that night whose name rarely got spoken aloud in front of visiting brass. Not because she wasn't qualified, but because her file carried classifications most people in this hospital weren't cleared to know existed. "Page Dr. Harlan," Reyes said quietly to the nurse beside him. "Tell her it's urgent." 2 floors down, in the surgical staff lounge, a young woman named Claire Harlan set down a lukewarm cup of coffee she hadn't finished in 3 hours. She was 34, blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, dressed in pale blue scrubs that gave no hint of who she really was. To the nurses who worked beside her, she was simply quiet, meticulous, unfailingly calm under pressure. The kind of surgeon who never raised her voice, never panicked, and always finished her charting before anyone else finished their coffee break. What none of them knew, because her records were sealed under a classification most hospital administrators couldn't access, was that before medical school, before the residency, before any of it, Claire Harlan had spent 6 years as a combat trauma surgeon embedded with special operations units in conflicts the public would never read about in a newspaper. She had operated in the backs of moving vehicles. She had kept men alive with equipment scavenged from downed helicopters. And she had done it all under the direct command of a young colonel who, at the time, went by a name his soldiers spoke with something close to reverence: Marcus Whitfield. The overhead page crackled through the lounge speaker. "Dr. Harlan to Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Harlan to Trauma Bay 2. Stat." She didn't rush. She never did. Claire rose, tied on a fresh set of gloves as she walked, and pushed through the double doors of the trauma bay with the tray of surgical instruments a nurse had already prepared and thrust into her hands. The hallway lights caught her hair as she crossed the threshold, and for a moment, everyone in the room turned to look, the residents parting instinctively to let her through, the way water parts around something that has clearly done this before. General Whitfield, gray-faced and furious, lifted his head from the pillow to see the surgeon he had demanded, and every word he had been about to say died somewhere in his throat. He knew that face. He had seen it caked in dust and blood in the back of a Black Hawk over hostile territory. He had seen it steady and unblinking while mortar rounds shook the walls of a forward operating base, her hands never trembling even as the ceiling rained plaster onto the operating table. He had watched that same face, younger then, tell him calmly that a soldier under her hands was not going to die today, and be right every single time. "Claire," he breathed, the name slipping out before rank or protocol could stop it. "Claire Whitmore." The room froze. Nurses looked from the general to the surgeon and back again, utterly lost. Dr. Reyes's eyebrows shot up. Claire, who had not gone by the name Whitmore in nearly a decade, who had buried that name along with a uniform and a set of dog tags she kept in a drawer she rarely opened, met the general's eyes without flinching. "It's Harlan now, sir," she said, her voice as even and unshakable as it had been under mortar fire. "But yes, it's me." Whitfield let out something between a laugh and a sob. pain and disbelief tangled together. Of all the hospitals, of all the surgeons, you're telling me the best trauma surgeon in this building has been hiding in scrubs this whole time? I'm telling you, Claire said, already moving to the wound, already assessing with the practiced eye of someone who had done this 1,000 times in far worse conditions, that you're going to shut up and let me work, General, exactly like old times. A few nurses exchanged stunned glances. Dr. Reyes took a half-step back, sensing without being told that command of this room had just quietly changed hands. And as Claire's fingers moved with calm, exact precision toward the wound that had nearly taken a 3-star general's life, something in the room shifted. The fear replaced by something closer to awe. Nobody in that trauma bay yet understood the full weight of what they were witnessing. They didn't know about the extraction in the mountains that had earned Claire a medal she never wore. They didn't know about the night she had operated for 11 straight hours to save a man everyone else had given up on. All they knew was that the general who had demanded the best surgeon in the building had gotten exactly what he asked for, and had nearly fainted from shock before she'd even touched the wound. If you've ever wondered what kind of quiet, unassuming person might be standing beside you with a past you could never imagine, make sure you're subscribed, because this story, this reunion between a broken general and the woman who once saved his life on a battlefield most people will never hear about, is only just beginning. Claire's hands worked with a precision that silenced the room faster than any order could have. She called for retractors, for suction, for a unit of blood on standby, her voice never rising above a calm, clipped efficiency that the trauma team fell into step with almost instinctively, as though some deep, professional part of them recognized real command when they heard it, regardless of rank or title on a badge. Dr. Reyes, initially poised to assist, found himself instead handing her instruments before she even finished asking for them, watching with something close to reverence as she located the source of the bleeding. A nicked artery hidden beneath layers of scar tissue from old wounds nobody else in the room had known existed. "He's got shrapnel scarring in here," Claire murmured, almost to herself as she worked. "Old. Years old." She glanced up briefly, just once, at Whitfield's pale face. "You never had that properly repaired, did you? You just kept going." "Didn't have time," Whitfield rasped, drifting on the edge of consciousness as the anesthesia took hold. "Didn't have you." The comment landed heavier than he probably intended, and for a moment Claire's hands paused. Just a fraction of a second, imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read her stillness the way soldiers learn to read a commanding officer's face before a mission. Then she continued, clamping the artery, calling for irrigation, moving through the repair with the same unshakable focus that had once kept dying men alive in the back of moving convoys under fire. 40 minutes later, the bleeding was controlled. The monitors, which had been screaming warnings since Whitfield arrived, settled into a steady, healthy rhythm. Claire stepped back from the table, peeled off her gloves, and allowed herself, for the first time since walking into the room, to breathe. "He's stable," she told Reyes, who nodded, still visibly shaken by what he'd just witnessed. "Get him prepped for post-op monitoring. I want eyes on him every 15 minutes for the next 2 hours." "Yes, doctor," Reyes said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and respectful, made clear that whatever hierarchy had existed in that room before Claire walked in had been permanently rewritten. It was nearly an hour later, once Whitfield had been moved to recovery and the frantic energy of the trauma bay had finally settled, that Claire found herself standing beside his bed again, alone this time, the overhead lights dimmed to something gentler. Whitfield's eyes fluttered open, hazy from the anesthesia, and focused slowly on her face. "I always wondered what happened to you," he said, his voice thick and slow, "after you left the unit. Nobody would tell me anything. Classified, they said. Like you'd just vanished." "I didn't vanish," Claire said softly, pulling a chair beside the bed and sitting for the first time in hours. "I just changed uniforms. Scrubs don't ask as many questions as dog tags do." Whitfield managed a weak, pained smile. "You saved my life twice now. Once in those mountains, and now in this building where nobody even knew who you were." "I did my job both times," Claire said, and there was something quietly fierce beneath the modesty in her voice. "That's all it ever was, sir. Doing the job in front of me, whether anyone was watching or not. That's the thing about real heroes. Whitfield murmured, his eyes growing heavy again as sleep pulled at him. They never need anyone watching to do the right thing. He reached out, weak but deliberate, and gripped her hand. Thank you, Claire, for everything, then and now. Outside the recovery room, word had already begun to spread through the hospital in hushed, disbelieving whispers. The quiet, unassuming surgeon nobody paid much attention to had turned out to be a decorated former combat trauma surgeon, who had once operated under enemy fire to save the very general now recovering in her care. Nurses who had worked beside Claire for years suddenly found themselves looking at her differently, seeing not just a colleague, but someone who had lived an entire hidden chapter of extraordinary courage before ever stepping foot in this hospital. Dr. Reyes found her in the staff lounge later that night, sitting quietly with the same lukewarm coffee she'd abandoned hours earlier, now completely cold. You could have told someone, he said, not accusingly, just genuinely curious, about your background, about all of it. Claire looked up at him, and for the first time all night, something like exhaustion, real human exhaustion, showed through the calm composure she'd maintained since the moment she walked into that trauma bay. Some parts of who you were, she said quietly, you carry alone, not because you're ashamed of them, because they're not stories. They're memories of people who didn't make it home, and people who did because you refused to let them go. That's not something you bring up over coffee breaks. Reyes nodded slowly, understanding settling over him. Well, he said, managing a small, respectful smile. For what it's worth, this hospital is lucky to have you, whether anyone knew it before tonight or not. Claire allowed herself a rare, genuine smile in return. Just doing the job, she said again, echoing the same words she told the general hours earlier, words that, for a woman who had spent years being extraordinary while asking for no recognition at all, meant more than any medal ever could. By morning, General Whitfield was stable, recovering, and already demanding to know when he could be discharged. A sign, everyone agreed, that he was well on his way to a full recovery. And somewhere in that hospital, a quiet surgeon who had spent years hiding an extraordinary past continued her rounds exactly as she always had, without fanfare, without recognition, simply doing the job in front of her, one patient at a time.